for a kind introduction. It was long enough, but if you'll forgive me, I want to extend it by mentioning a couple of things. First of all, my main activity now is writing Rubin reports. One of my main activities is writing Rubin reports on Blogspot. I'm a featured columnist at Pajamas Media, and it hasn't been announced yet, but I'm going to be the Middle East editor at Pajamas Media. In addition to that, I want to mention to you that in November 1st, my new book called Israel Introduction will be published by Yale University Press. This book is an attempt to present Israel as a normal country, including economics, culture, people, land, and all aspects, and not just the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict or stuff like that. And in case I don't get back here before then, next spring, we'll publish my book, which I love to talk about now, but I have other duties, called Nazis, Radical Arabs, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, which is based on thousands of pages of hitherto unseen archival material which changed my view of the region. Just to give one small example, Ambassador Moshe Aarons referred to the 48 War of Independence, the 47 and 48. One of the things we discovered was that most of the weapons used by the Palestinian Arabs were weapons that were given by the Germans in 1942 for an uprising in Egypt, which they retrieved in 1946 with the help of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that was maybe the main single source of arms for them, using weapons that had been provided by the Nazis, whose first use was supposed to be wiping out all the Jews in Cairo in 1942. I'll stop there on that point. I should also say, since we're in Quebec, mesdames et messieurs, c'est mon plaisir à vous parler ce soir. Et je veux parler en français, mais j'ai peur que le PQ et les autorités québécoises n'aiment pas mon accent. Et c'est un problème avec la loi. I'll do more if you want. Having said that, it reminds me that at one time I was a student of Chinese. I went on my first trip to China, and after a while I carefully formulated a sentence to the driver saying something like, "Your car is very nice." And because I could understand some of what they were saying, and I said it, and he turned to the translator and said, and the funny thing is I could understand his Chinese, what language is that man speaking? So I decided to become a Middle East expert instead. Now, I don't want to repeat anything that Ambassador Aarons said, one of my heroes, and I hope considered, and will object if I say someone I consider a good friend and a great man. So I want to talk about everything he said. I'm not going to talk about. I will say that at times in his talk, I felt like he was delivering the good news, and my job was to deliver the bad news. So keep that in mind. Now, what I want to talk about is this very bizarre situation that we're in at present. And what makes it bizarre is not only the scope of change, but the incredible gap between the reality of the Middle East and the perception of events and changes in the Middle East, in most of the West, including universities, the mass media, and often in governments. Nothing I say, by the way, should be interpreted as reflecting on Canada, which I'm not going to talk about. And this gap is amazing, and it's a source of much frustration and bewilderment sometimes on my part, how ridiculous it is. Now let me just take one example that took place in the last 24 hours. I'll come back to this in a moment. Lebanon has a new government. This government is controlled to a large extent by Iran and by Syria and by Hezbollah. The taxi driver I had earlier today, who was a Lebanese Christian, understood that completely. There are 30 seats in the new cabinet. 18 of those seats, 60%, are held by Hezbollah, which is a revolutionary Islamist terrorist group intent on committing genocide in Israel, destroying Western influence in the Middle East, spreading the influence of Iran and Syria, and overthrowing all the non-Islamist regimes. So what is the headline? I mean, you cannot make this stuff up. What's the headline in the New York Times covering this story? And I hope I don't misquote it, but I think it's pretty accurate. The headline is, Hezbollah expected to have influence on new Lebanese government. Now, 60% of the cabinet members are Hezbollah. I mean, this is, so I'm not going to get into why we have this insanity, but we have it. We used to say that Israel was the canary in the coal mine, meaning that, you know, the canary in the coal mine is there because if, they don't use them anymore, I'm sure, but if the oxygen sinks too low, the canary faints, and it's a signal for the miners to get out. Well, Israel was the canary in the coal mine, and the cave-in has long happened, long ago happened. We are used to the idea, at least since 1982, if not before, that Israel is unfairly represented and slandered, and the news is slanted against it. But suddenly, in recent years, we have discovered that Israel is no longer alone. That there are a huge number of other issues and other things that get the old treatment accorded to Israel. So I'm used to a world in which things function pretty normally. The news coverage is relatively accurate. But when it comes to Israel, there are lots of questions and problems. But now I see that that has extended to the entire Middle East. We have a crisis coming, which a Canadian journalist I talked to yesterday talked of as a perfect storm. And I believe that we are heading into serious crisis that in some ways resembles the Middle East as it looked in the late 50s and through the 60s and into the early 70s, but also different. The central issue in the Middle East today, and if you understand this, then you can understand everything, is the struggle of revolutionary Islamists to seize state power in every country in the Middle East, to wipe Israel off the map, to destroy Western influence in the region, to bring down existing regimes, and probably put much of the elite of these countries in front of a firing squad. And that's what you have to understand, because the Jordanians understand it, the Saudis understand it, a lot of other people, I'll come back to talking about, understand it. So when I'm speaking pessimistically, we also have certain assets that we didn't have in the past. What are the elements of the very dramatic changes that are happening in the region that are ignored or misunderstood to a startling extent? And I want to start with Egypt. I should start with Turkey, but I'll start with Egypt. So when Ambassador Aaron says the word September, he's referring to Palestinians. But when I say the word September, I'm referring to the Egyptians, because that's when the parliamentary elections are scheduled. And by the way, if you want to remember one sentence of this talk, remember this one. By the end of this year, more than 250 million people may well be living under revolutionary Islamist governments. And most of those numbers are contributed by Turkey, Egypt, and of course Iran. October 7th of last year, I read a speech made by Mohammed Badi, the head of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And I felt this marked a major shift. Badi, who's, by the way, relatively new, I think he'd been in office for less than a year, so he's not somebody old who's been there forever, basically sounded like Osama bin Laden. He said, now is the time for jihad, America is weak, we have to overthrow America, we have to attack Israel, we have to move against the regime in Egypt because it's weak, and so on. I thought this was very significant. So I wrote an article entitled, The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood has declared war on America. Will anyone in America notice? And a number of my friends wrote me afterward and said, nope, nobody noticed. Nobody picked it up. Now, this is not coming out of my head. This is a speech made by the head of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which I took as signaling for the first time that they were moving from a base-building phase to a revolutionary phase. And so when the Egyptian Revolution broke out in January, and I don't say this to schwitz, but I want to establish my credentials here, I think I was the first person in the world to say, well, the title of the article was, I'm really worried about Egypt because no one else is. Now, we don't have the time. I would love to give you a very detailed analysis about who made the revolution, what happened, how the media missed it. But I'll summarize it as saying that while, of course, there were genuine moderate Democrats, that most of the power was coming from the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists. Some of it was coming from radical leftists. And again, if somebody wants to talk, I'll give you a very detailed assessment of it. The problem is that the Western journalists go and they talk to people like them, and they think that people are like them. So they go and they talk to middle-class people who speak English in Cairo, and then say, this represents Egypt. Egypt's a country of 80 million people. Most of them live in villages. Most of them do not use Facebook. I'm cutting a lot of anecdotes because so I don't want to go on too long. The point is this. The Muslim Brotherhood was portrayed, at least from January through May, as a moderate government that had abandoned violence and wanted democracy. Now, there is not a single speech made by any Muslim Brotherhood leader in the broad sense in Arabic that reflected any of that. They continued to talk about jihad. They supported violence against Israel. They supported violence in Iraq. And there wasn't a single article that appeared in Arabic in any Muslim Brotherhood publication that reflected that. And yet, day after day, we were told, to the highest point of ridicule, when the head of American intelligence said in a congressional hearing that the Muslim Brotherhood was a secular organization. And as my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Spire, said, maybe the word Muslim in the name should have been a tip-off. So, therefore, this issue was miscalculated. And we are facing, as I hope to demonstrate to you in about 1 minute, a situation in which by the end of this year, Egypt will be ruled by a radical, not maybe Islamist, maybe not, but a radical regime, anti-American, anti-Canadian, and not willing to keep the peace treaty with Israel. Whatever they may say they're keeping it, but they won't. Now let me prove it to you very simply. And if you want texts, my two key texts here is the memory guide to presidential candidates and the Al-Ahram, which is Egypt's leading newspaper, guide to political parties. If you actually study the documents, you see the following. Nobody's getting organized except the Islamists. On the parliamentary election, as of today, there's no conservative establishment, quote, Mubarak regime party. There's no real or important moderate democratic party. And to my surprise, there's not even any nationalist party. The only parties that are really organized is Muslim Brotherhood, some smaller Islamist parties, and various extreme left, anti-American, anti-Israel parties. Now, therefore, and the Muslim Brotherhood originally said, we don't want power, so we're only going to run for 30% of the seats and no presidential candidate. Then it became, as they built confidence, it became 50% of the seats and no presidential candidate. Now it's 50% of the seats and the presidential candidate. Who knows what they're going to say by September. Amr Moussa is the most popular politician in Egypt. and he's an interesting guy. I'd love to talk about him. Maybe he'll be president. Either he'll be president or Muslim Brotherhood person will be president. Amr Moussa gave an interview, I think to the Wall Street Journal, but it may have been the Washington Post. And in the course of the interview, he said in passing, oh, and I believe the Muslim Brotherhood, or I believe that the Islamists will have a majority in parliament. Not a single newspaper picked up that. When the most popular politician in Egypt said, and possibly the next president, said, yeah, the Islamists are going to win control of parliament, I think that's a pretty significant fact. And I'm the only one I know of who wrote about it, about that interview. The likelihood then is that in September, the Muslim Brotherhood will get 35, 40%, smaller Islamist parties may get 10%, the radical left will get 5 or 10%, there'll be a lot of independents that the Islamists can pick up, and therefore a parliament with a radical majority that wants to tear up peace with Israel is going to, and to convert, many of them to convert Egypt to an Islamist state, are going to write the new Egyptian constitution. And then there'll be a president elected. Now, we can realistically evaluate the following set of scenarios. Next year, or the year after, if and when Hamas decides, on the basis of being confident that Egypt is behind it, starts attacking Israel again, with rockets, with mortars, with cross-border raids, at some point, whatever day it happens, Israel will retaliate and defend itself. We cannot assume that Egypt will stand aside. Maybe they will, but we cannot assume it. What's the argument they won't do anything? The rational actor argument, which has so often failed in the Middle East, that they want to get $1.8 billion of US aid, the military wants to get it, and they don't want to risk losing it. But we saw what happened with the Iranian Revolution. We saw what happened with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. We saw what happened with Yasser Arafat's behavior. Yasser Arafat's a rational actor. If you offer an independent state and $23 billion and so on and so forth, of course he'll accept it because he's a rational actor. So the rational actor model doesn't work, and therefore it may not work with Egypt. At a maximum, it is possible that Egypt will join in the war. And at a minimum, it is probable that Egypt would allow volunteers, thousands of volunteers, guns, money, terrorists to flood into Gaza, and that through, not necessarily by an order from the government, but simply the decision of low-ranking military men and security officials, they'll let terrorists cross the Egypt-Israel border. What happens if Egypt stops respecting the peace treaty? What happens if Egypt does these kinds of things? Well, leaving aside all the things that Ambassador Aaron's talked, just in the realm of international diplomacy, Israel will go to the United States and say, you're a guarantor of this treaty. What are you going to do about it? Well, what is the Obama administration going to do about it? So therefore, events in Egypt are extraordinarily important and extraordinarily dangerous, and there is virtually no recognition of this fact in Europe or in southern North America. By the way, I just mentioned now, remember, it's in this context that people are telling Israel that it has to hurry and make concessions and create a Palestinian state. At the very moment when the security situation is worsening, is not the time that you take additional risks. And the argument being, this is a window of opportunity, you better do it now. Well, what, we better do it now so that when Hamas takes over, if it does, the Palestinian state, that they'll have it ready for them? I mean, one of the things that really amazes me is the total lack of logic in the arguments we're hearing. Anyway, that's Egypt. Turkey. Turkey's economy is the first Israeli exchange professor in Turkey. I'm the editor of Turkish Studies. I have many Turkish friends. I follow the country closely. I've been there like 25 times. Turkey is undergoing an Islamist transformation A lot of Turks know it. The U.S. Embassy in Ankara knows it because we can see it in WikiLeaks. The U.S. government, the White House certainly doesn't know it. The Europeans, if they know it, they're not acting on it. In the election last Sunday, the AK Party got almost 50% of the vote. They will be in office for 4 more years. Okay? They will write a new constitution. They did not get enough votes to just write it and that's that, but they got enough votes to pretty easily write it and submit it to a referendum. These people are killing Turkish democracy. There are more journalists in jail in Turkey than there are in Iran or China, by a big margin. When the introduction house said I read a column for the Turkish Daily News. That's no longer true because I wrote something that critical of the government. They were paralyzed with fear, and I got an insulting letter within 2 hours canceling my column forever. People are scared. The government controls about 1/3 of the media. Thousands of people have been arrested. I could go on and tell you anecdotes and specific stories. I know 7 Turkish journalists who have lost their jobs for political reasons. This country, Turkey, is changing sides. Turkish government views itself as allied with Iran, Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah. These people are Islamists. If we're off the record, I'll tell you that I had a conversation with somebody who said words to the following effect: we warned you about these people, you can't trust them, they want to make Turkey into an Islamist state. That was spoken by a Turkish career official. This is no secret. You can find out this stuff. If you read Rubin Reports, www.rubinreports.blogspot.com, look at my quote from an article in Hürriyet newspaper where a Turkish journalist analyzes Prime Minister Erdogan's victory speech as showing that he has turned toward the Islamic and Islamist world. There's not a single reference to Europe and the West in that speech. He said it's a victory for the Palestinians, a victory for the Bosnians, a victory for the Azerbaijanis, and he had like a couple of other references in there. This is not the Turkey of Kemal Ataturk. And the alignment, the cooperation between Turkey and Israel is finished. One Turkish friend who is not Jewish, I really respect, the person I most respect on Turkey, a very sound person, said, you must understand these people, i.e. the government, hates Jews. Jews are leaving Turkey. I mean, I could go on, I could tell you a lot more. Therefore, while Egypt has changed sides, Turkey has changed sides and is an asset. Remember I said at the beginning, the revolutionary Islamist movement. Now, not all the revolutionary Islamists cooperate. One of the things we're starting to see is Iran, Turkey, Egypt are competing to sort of be hegemon in the region. That's why I said we're back in the 60s and 70s. Iraq is out of the picture. Syria is out of the picture. So you've got Turkey. Turkey says, we want to be the leader of the Muslims. Iran says, we want to be the leader of the Muslims. And Egypt is increasingly saying, we want to be a leader of the Arabs. And in part, we're opposed to these non-Arabs, who claim to be the leader. Now, I submit that the crossing over of 2 of the biggest, strongest, most important countries in the Middle East to the side of, if I may refer to it as such, the enemy is a rather significant development. And yet, there is no realization of this and no action being taken on this in the leadership of several important countries. But that's not the end. And by the way, I don't intend to talk about Libya and Syria and Yemen. Those are also factors, but I'm just giving you the clearest ones. There's another one, which is Lebanon. As I mentioned earlier, yesterday was a turning point in the history of Lebanon. On the one hand, the Syrians and Iranians reestablished their control over Lebanon, which, of course, the Syrians had before. But what's new is Hezbollah is 60% of the cabinet. And these people, like Hamas, like the Iranian regime, like the Muslim Brotherhood, are anti-Semites who want to commit genocide. And people who know me know that I don't say things like that lightly. Okay? I only say this because this is what the evidence shows. So Lebanon has joined the other side. So you've got here three, Egypt, Turkey, and Lebanon, three major victories for the other side. Here's a fourth one, Hamas. Now Hamas is, the fact that Hamas and Fatah could join in a coalition to run the Palestinian Authority without any strong American response, without threats, without cutoff of aid is incredible. But that's not what I want to focus on. Here's what I want to focus on. The goal of Israeli policy was to maintain a high level of sanctions to prevent Hamas from stabilizing as a government. Now, one might think that Israel should go in and overthrow Hamas, but at least as a minimum, this strategy of keeping them off balance, and this strategy is gone. It's gone originally because the Obama administration pressured Israel to reduce the sanctions to a minimum because Israeli soldiers landed on a ship, were attacked, and 9 jihadists were killed. That was it. And then, of course, the fact that Hamas now has a very in addition to its Iranian allies and Syrian allies, they have a very powerful ally, Egypt. So they're full of confidence. And that is another victory for the revolutionary Islamists. This morning, I was very upset because one of my best friends, Syrian friends, sent out a note, and he listed all the people killed in all the massacres. And at the top of the note, he said, people are being massacred and nobody cares. And the thing is, he's not wrong. So in addition to those positive victories for the revolutionary Islamists are the following victories. The West did not lift a finger to help the Lebanese moderates of the March 14 coalition. They were in power. They fell from power. They didn't get help and support. The West did very little or nothing to help the Iranian dissidents in their struggle against the regime. The West did little or nothing to help the Turkish oppositionists in their struggle against an Islamist party, which was taking away their freedom. So in addition to the victories the Islamists have won in Egypt, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran, we'll come to in 1 second, there were the victories of the fact that people who opposed them did not get Western support and either were defeated or had to give up the effort. I could say a lot more. I just want to talk about 2 other things briefly. Iran, which I'll skip over quickly because I think you really know about that. But let me make an important point. The issue with Iran is not only, and in many ways, not even primarily the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue is of huge and tremendous importance, but we should not forget that the goal of Iran is not, the main goal or the totality of the goals of Iran is not to fire nuclear missiles at Israel. Their main goal is to take over leadership and control of as much of the Middle East as they can. And nothing in the way of deterrence, of anti-missile, is going to stop that fact. And this is a fact that Southern North America does not appreciate. What would happen if Iran got nuclear weapons, totally leaving aside for the purpose of this discussion whether they would be fired at Israel? Very important, but it's not the only side. What would happen? Number one, Every country in the Arabic-speaking world would have to appease Iran, especially because they know that they cannot depend on the United States. Number two, every European country would appease Iran. Number three, the price of oil would spiral upward. Number four, it may well set off a very dangerous arms race in the region. But my personal favorite is number five. It would inject an incredible enthusiasm and hope among revolutionary Islamists. Thousands of people are going to join revolutionary Islamist movements saying they won, they achieved what the Arab nationalists couldn't. And therefore, this is the winning side, and I want to be on it. This is a strategic disaster for the West. It ain't so great for Israel, and it isn't so great for a lot of Arabs, and a lot of Turks, and a lot of Iranians who oppose the regime. The irony is that we have reached a point where the interests of many of the peoples in the Middle East and many of the governments in the Middle East who will publicly say they hate Israel now have interests paralleling Israel. We have to figure out how we can use that. Now, in the face of these developments and more, and I can demonstrate them, and it's on the public record, there is the failure of academia, and the failure of media, and the failure of governments, especially the Obama administration. I do not make partisan speeches. I have to do this because it's political analysis, and you cannot leave this aside. You have a government which has an ideology, which is mistaken, which is disastrous, and there are reasons. I mean, one factor that people don't appreciate, and this comes out of the CIA, is what is the view of Islamism and the kinds of things I'm talking about. And basically the view is this: Al-Qaeda is a very bad and dangerous organization that wants to attack America, but Hamas and Hezbollah and the Muslim Brotherhood are not dangerous organizations because they don't really want to attack the World Trade Center, so the United States can try to make them friends or neutralize them. This is a disaster. In fact, one could argue that on an intellectual level and so on, this is worse miscalculation than was made about Germany in the 30s, partly because we have the historical experience of the 1930s and the 40s with the Soviet Union. So we have a government that doesn't want to show leadership, that wants to show it's weak, that got rid of an ally in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, that sided against the oppositions in Iran and now in Syria, and then we come to U.S.-Israel relations, which I'm not even going to talk about because you know already, but there are one or two details I want to say. You know, if you really read the speeches, you really get a sense of what people are saying. Everybody on Obama's State Department speech focused on the sentence which said something like, "We, the United States, favor the 1967 borders based on mutual swaps, mutually agreed borders." And the whole debate was conducted around that sentence. And then the White House could say things like, well, we said mutually agreed. But that's not the important sentence. The important sentence was Obama's concept of how to achieve that. And it went something like, I'm giving my interpretation so it's more vaguely worded, but it basically went something like this. Israel will turn over the entire West Bank to the Palestinian Authority in exchange for security guarantees, and then we'll negotiate the other issues. Now, if that's not what he meant, he shouldn't have said it. So what does that say? It says Israel returns to the 1967 borders quickly, and then they'll talk about Jerusalem refugees and border swaps. So it's even worse than people think. It's calling for the near immediate return of Israel to the 67 borders, which of course, even aside from everything Ambassador Aaron said, throws away all of Israel's leverage. You can go and look at the speech or look at my articles. This is what the guy said. Now, I'm going to come to a conclusion, and I apologize to you for going on so long, but as you can see, there's a lot of ground to cover. What is the rationale of the Obama administration for what it's doing? And the thing that you should never forget is that what the things that are in a lot of the media and the things that are being said by Israel's enemies are so transparently ridiculous that within 60 seconds you can often destroy them, which is why we have to be kept out of the universities and we have to be kept out of the mass media, because these arguments can only exist if people are prevented from answering them. So he said, Obama said, I have to do this because we have to keep the Europeans from voting for unilateral Palestinian independence in September. And so he went to Europe. Well, hey, excuse me, but may I point out, even leaving aside Canada, that the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy, which are the four major countries of Europe, all announced that they would vote against it before Obama made his speech. This is how transparently ridiculous. So what I said is, so in other words, this means that Israel should go back to the 67 borders in order to prevent Sweden and Spain from voting for unilateral independence in a General Assembly resolution that doesn't, as Ambassador Ernst, doesn't even count. But there's something else going on here, which is Obama has gotten himself into an incredibly bad situation. Because if, first, the demand for unilateral recognition will go to the Security Council. And I believe that the United States will have to veto it. And if President Obama vetoes it, he's going to be, and the United States is going to be very unpopular in the Muslim majority and Arab world. So he doesn't want to have to veto it. He wants to prevent it from reaching the United Nations. Now, what should he do? Well, he should have started campaigning when he first heard that they were thinking of doing this, saying, if you do this, it violates all your agreements, we'll cut off funds, we won't support you. American ambassadors should have been going into every country in the world, the office of the President or Prime Minister, and saying, we want you to come out against this, and if you do, we'll have better relations, and if you don't, we'll have worse relations. And they did nothing until it gained steam. So what basically the current strategy is to get Israel to pay to save Obama. That basically what they're saying is this: Palestinians are seeking unilateral independence, the UN. We must stop this because we don't want Obama to have to veto it. So how do we stop it? By giving them everything they want directly. Because if we give you everything you want, you don't have to go to the UN. So if we give you a basis for an independent state before September, then you don't have to go to the UN, and we don't have to vote, and we don't have to veto. Now, this is not the strategy of a great power, to retreat and surrender to the Palestinian Authority, which is its client, because they want to do something. This is incredible. This is destructive. This is incompetent. And this is worse. This is amazingly bad. Now, there are a lot of people in the State Department, the Defense Department, the Foreign Policy Establishment, which are watching and growing horror. And there are lots of people, and Democratic people in Congress, who are watching in horror. What more could you ask for as a demonstration of this than Prime Minister Netanyahu's reception in Washington at the joint session of Congress? I have never seen in my life anything like that reception. And what were they saying? The day after he put down Obama in the most pointed public conflict of any foreign leader, and they were cheering Bibi Netanyahu. What does that say? So we are in a race. We have to deal with these terrible crises that are coming up, the terrible disaster in the region, and it's a race, and one key element in this race is there have to be governments in power which either have some sense or can be forced by institutions in the society to behave as if they had sense, if only they're afraid. But I do want to stress to you, to sum up, that we are heading for an incredibly serious situation in which the revolutionary Islamists make huge advances and put us in an international situation which will undo a lot of the things that we have gained in the last 30 years. Now that's not an optimistic note, so let's go back to Ambassador Aarons' speech. Israel, as he said, can deal with it, will deal with it. People are awake, they understand the danger, and we're trying to get other people to understand the danger, not only to Israel, but also to the own interests of Western democracies, of relatively moderate Arab states, even if they hate Israel, and of real democratic oppositions who are struggling for their rights. And on the basis of that coalition, we have to move forward and struggle. And of course, I am equally convinced that we will win. Thank you for your time and attention.